Every fish finder ever built does exactly one honest thing. It knocks on the water, and then it waits to hear what knocks back. A pulse of sound drops down into the dark. It strikes a fish, a stump, a ledge, the bottom, and a sliver of that sound comes home. That returning echo is the only honest voice inside the entire machine. Everything else around it, the price on the box, the name stamped on the bezel, the size of the glass you are staring at, is decoration bolted on around that one honest moment. I spent a long time with headphones on, learning to hear what comes back. And once you learn to listen, you stop trusting almost everything they tell you at the counter. Because here is the thing they never say out loud. 8 different brand names are sending the same knock down the same water, off a part that most of them do not even build. Tonight you are going to learn who actually builds that part. You are going to learn why the $3,000 box and the $400 box are very often hearing the exact same answer come back. And you are going to learn the one free thing that decides whether that answer ever reaches you at all, the thing no salesman will ever point at, because there is no commission hanging on it. Stay with me, because they are counting on you tuning out long before we get there. Walk the marine electronics aisle, and you will count 8 names fighting for your money: Garmin, Lowrance, Simrad, B&G, Humminbird, Raymarine, Furuno, Si-Tex. 8 logos, 8 colors, 8 different stories about who sees more fish. That is the part they want you to believe, that you are standing in front of a real fight. But follow the money instead of the marketing, and the fight starts to look staged. Lowrance, Simrad, and B&G are not 3 rivals. They are 3 labels living under one roof, all owned by a corporation called Brunswick, the same company that builds a huge share of the boats those units get bolted into. Humminbird belongs to Johnson Outdoors, the same outfit that makes your Minn Kota trolling motor and your Canon downriggers. Raymarine is owned by a defense electronics giant named Teledyne FLIR, and Garmin stands on its own. So out of those 8 names, you trace 6 of them and you land on just 4 owners. Only Furuno and Si-Tex still stand alone. That is the first thing they would rather you never connect. Because the moment the wall stops looking like a battlefield, the prices stop making sense. And here is what matters even more than who owns whom. For freshwater, for the bass and the crappie and the walleye that most of you are actually chasing, the names you really shop come down to a small handful. And when it comes to the one part that does the listening, almost every one of them buys it from the same little building, same knock, same water, same answer coming home. Hold on to that, because to understand why it matters, you first have to know which part is doing the work. Here is the piece nobody at the counter wants to explain, because the second you understand it, the upsell quietly falls apart. It is the transducer, the puck. That little black or bronze block that hangs off your transom, mounts through your hull, or clamps onto the foot of your trolling motor. That puck is the entire performance. It is the only part of your whole rig that actually speaks to the water. It sends the sound down, it listens for the echo coming back, and it carries that echo up the wire. The screen has never heard a fish in its life. All it does is read back what the puck brings home. Like a court stenographer typing up testimony it never witnessed. A more expensive screen types that testimony out in prettier handwriting. It cannot change a single word of what was said. Sit with that for a second, because it rewrites the entire purchase. When a salesman tells you the $3,000 unit sees fish, that the $400 unit cannot, the first words out of your mouth should be, which puck is on each one? Because if it is the same puck, or a close cousin of it, and very often it is, then both units are hearing the identical answer come back off the identical fish. One of them simply reads it out in a louder, brighter voice. The fish does not care how nice the handwriting is, and neither should you. That is the first thing they bury. Not a lie, exactly. Just a question they are hoping you never think to ask. But there is a second thing buried even deeper, and it is the one that should make you a little angry. For years, they sold one feature as the top-shelf upgrade. It is called CHIRP. Picture older Sonar as one finger tapping a single piano key, over and over, trying to guess what is down there in the dark from one repeating note. CHIRP does not tap one key. It runs a whole sweep across the keyboard in a single ping, from the low notes up to the high. And that sweep is exactly what lets your unit pull two Crappie sitting inches apart into two separate marks, instead of one fat smudge. It is a genuine leap. It is the single biggest jump in what you can actually see on a sonar screen in 20 years. So here is what should bother you. CHIRP is not a premium feature anymore. It is sitting inside units that cost under $600 right now, today. The biggest clarity upgrade in 2 decades already came in the cheap box, and the expensive box is selling you that very same CHIRP through a bigger pane of glass. You do not even have to take my word for it. The company that builds most of these transducers prints the number in their own catalog. They say a CHIRP sweep puts somewhere between 10 and 1,000 times more sound energy into the water than the old single-note Sonar did. That is their figure, in their own marketing, not mine. The leap is real. It is just no longer the thing you should be paying a fortune for. And the frequencies underneath all of it are not technology you buy. They are physics. A frequency is just a number, and the water answers that number the exact same way, whether the box around it costs $600 or $6,000. 200 kilohertz gives you a tight, detailed cone, perfect for picking fish apart in shallow water. 83 kilohertz throws a wider, fuzzier cone that covers more ground. Drop down to 50 kilohertz and you punch deep, all the way to the bottom of the deepest reservoir you fish, trading fine detail for raw depth. And the imaging frequencies, 455, 800, the 1.2 megahertz mega stuff, those paint the photograph style side and down pictures of brush piles and standing timber. Every bit of that capability lives inside the puck and the software. A bigger screen can draw it larger. It cannot show you one single fish that the small screen did not already hear. So if the magic is not in the glass, where does it actually come from? It comes from a town you have probably never heard of. Up in Milford, New Hampshire, there is a company called Airmar. You have likely never heard the name, and that is by design, because they never put their logo on your boat. Airmar is the primary supplier of these sonar transducers to the entire fishing electronics industry. They build the pucks that show up under Garmin, under Lowrance, under Simrad, under Raymarine, under Furuno, under Humminbird. The same factory, the same ceramic element sealed inside. The only thing that truly changes from brand to brand is the plug spliced onto the end, so the same voice can introduce itself in each brand's accent. And they do not even hide it. They call it a mix-and-match system, and they sell the adapter cables right out in the open. Here is the part that ties this whole thing together. Inside that puck is a tiny embedded identity chip. When you power up your fish finder, the screen sends a question down the wire, basically asking, "Who are you?" And the puck answers back with its model, its frequency bands, its power limits. Airmar trademarked that little handshake. They call it Transducer ID. And because the same handshake is built into Garmin, into Lowrance, into Simrad, into Raymarine, into Humminbird, the very core of how these units listen is standardized across the entire industry. So when I tell you 8 brands are running the same sonar chip, I am not being dramatic. On the higher-end gear, a great many of them are running one supplier's sensor and one supplier's identity chip, wearing 8 different costumes. Nothing inside that puck changed from one logo to the next. The badge changed. The price absolutely changed. But here is what they really do not want you holding on to. They do not just quietly share a supplier. They have been caught sharing the technology itself in a courtroom. The fancy imaging, the side scanning and down scanning that paint those photo-like pictures, has a paper trail that ends the whole argument by itself. Navico, the parent company of Lowrance and Simrad, took Garmin to federal court down in Texas over its down-scanning patents. And a jury did not just find that Garmin infringed. They found that Garmin did it willfully, and they set the damages at nearly $39 million. Willfully. That is the jury's word, not mine. Then in February of 2018, instead of fighting it to the bitter end, those two companies signed a broad cross-licensing deal, agreeing to share the patents and the intellectual property between them. And it does not stop with those two. A few years earlier, Humminbird's parent company hauled Garmin in front of the International Trade Commission over scanning, and won. The commission ruled that Garmin's side-scan sonar infringed Humminbird's patent. So watch what is really happening here. The brands you think are racing each other to invent the best imaging are, behind the curtain, suing each other and then licensing the same imaging back and forth. They fight over it in front of a judge on Monday. They sign a private treaty on Friday. And the invoice for both the war and the peace gets stapled to your receipt. So this next time a sticker promises you one brand's down imaging lives in a different league, just remember that a federal jury already heard otherwise. Which brings us straight to the question you actually came here for. If the cheap box here's the same fish, then what on earth is the extra money buying? I am not going to stand here and tell you the expensive units are a scam from top to bottom. That would be a lie, and you would hear it in my voice. When you spend the extra money, you do get real hardware. You get a bigger, brighter screen that you can read in direct sun at noon. You get a faster processor, so you can split that screen 4 ways without it stuttering. You get networking, the wiring to run one transducer to 2 or 3 displays, and tie all your electronics together around the boat. Those are real useful things. But read that list back to yourself slowly. Brightness, speed, wiring, a nicer map. Not one item on that list changes the question your puck asks the water. Not one of them changes the answer that comes back. Every dollar you spend above a solid mid-tier unit is buying you a control room and a bigger window to sit inside it. It is not buying you the ability to hear one more fish. The actual finding, the seeing of an actual bass tucked into a brush pile at 20 feet that came in the cheap box. You can pay 10 times more, but you cannot pay your way into hearing a fish that the budget unit already heard. And just when you think the spending finally stops at the register, they reach into your pocket one more time, quietly, every single year. The maps. You would think that after dropping serious money on a chart plotter, the maps just come with it, forever. They do not. You bought the hardware one time. The maps that hardware runs on want paying again every year. The 2 giant chart brands out there are Navionics and CMAP. And here is the quiet part. Navionics is owned by Garmin. CMAP is owned by Brunswick, the Lowrance and Simrad people. So the very same companies that sold you the box also own the maps that box needs. And they sell those maps to you on a subscription. Stop paying, and your depth shading and your auto-routing freeze in place, while the lake keeps changing around you. You did not just buy a brand of electronics. You signed up for a meter that keeps running long after you have parked the car. It is a beautiful arrangement if you happen to be the one collecting. Now, I told you there was one honest upgrade sitting on that expensive shelf. There is, and I would be lying to you if I pretended there was not. Everything I have told you so far is about traditional sonar, the ping straight down, the side imaging, the down imaging. On all of that, the cheap unit and the expensive unit are hearing the same world. But there is a newer technology that genuinely breaks that rule. It is called live, or forward-facing, sonar. Garmin sells it as live scope. Lowrance calls it active target. Humminbird calls it mega live. And it is not a screen trick. It runs on a completely different kind of transducer, one packed with multiple little elements that sweep a beam across a wide arc out in front of your boat, steering the sound electronically without moving a single physical part. What you get is not a scrolling history of water you already drifted over. It is live, moving video of the fish in front of you right now in real time. You can watch a bass swim up to your jig, study it, and decide whether to eat. You can watch your lure fall through the column and watch a fish peel off the bottom to chase it down. And here is how I know it is the real thing and not just marketing. It works so well that the pros banned it. The National Professional Fishing League outlawed forward-facing sonar completely for the 2025 season. The Bassmaster Circuit did not ban it outright, but they leashed it hard, down to a single live transducer mounted at the bow. And Major League Fishing went further still, capping how much screen you are even allowed to run. Think hard about what that means. No rule book in this entire sport has ever banned a brighter screen. Nobody writes a rule limiting the size of your display. They wrote those rules because one specific sound got too good at catching fish. So yes, live sonar is the one place where spending more money actually buys you more fish, instead of just more glass. It will run you north of $1,000 as its own system, on top of whatever screen you already own. And for a lot of you who fish brush and timber and suspended crappie, that is a smarter place to put your money than any bigger display will ever be. But, and this is the entire point of everything I have told you tonight, even live sonar, the one upgrade that is genuinely worth paying for, is dead on arrival if you get the free thing wrong. So here it is. The single variable that decides whether your sonar finds fish or finds mud has nothing to do with the brand, nothing to do with the price, and nothing to do with the screen. It is where the puck is mounted, and whether it is sitting in clean, undisturbed water. That is it. That is the secret nobody at the counter will ever point at, because there is no markup on it. Your puck reads by listening for a clean echo. Now picture trying to take a phone call standing right next to a running outboard. The voice on the other end is there, the whole time. You just cannot hear it through the roar. That is exactly what happens when you mount your transducer in the churn behind your propeller, or down low behind a rivet or a hull strake, where the water tumbles and fills up with tiny air bubbles. And here is the physics, because it is genuinely worth knowing. Sound travels beautifully through solid water. But the gap between how sound moves through water and how it moves through an air bubble is enormous, on the order of thousands to one. At a mismatch that big, almost none of the sound makes it across that boundary. It bounces straight back. A cloud of tiny bubbles becomes, for all practical purposes, an acoustic brick wall. Your puck goes blind. It throws you a flickering garbage screen, and it marks a bottom that is not even there. The unit is not broken. Out on the water, drowning in bubbles, it just might as well be. A $3,000 unit fed a turbulent, bubbly signal will read worse than a $400 unit fed clean, smooth water. That is not my opinion. That is straight out of the manufacturer's own install guide, which tells you to mount the puck in undisturbed water, parallel to the waterline, well clear of the prop. On most boats, that means out toward the side where the propeller blades are sweeping downward, away from that rising wall of bubbles. Ask anyone who rigs boats for a living, and they will tell you that a huge share of the dead screen units handed to them were never broken at all. They were just badly mounted. So the most expensive box on the entire wall, bolted on in a hurry by someone who tucked the puck behind a strake, will lose every single time to a budget box that somebody took 20 careful mitts to mount in clean water. The greatest upgrade in this whole sport is not sitting on a shelf. It is in the mounting, and it costs you nothing but patience. If you ever want this written down, the mounting rules, the frequency cheat sheet, the cross-brand compatibility tricks, all on one page, I put it together as a field blueprint. Scan the code on screen or grab the link down below. That is the only time I will mention it. So here is the whole thing in one breath. 8 names on the wall. 4 owners standing behind most of them. 1 supplier up in New Hampshire feeding a huge share of the same sensors down into the same water. A courtroom that already proved they pass the imaging back and forth between them. And an expensive shelf that mostly sells you brightness, speed, and a subscription that never stops billing. The fish finding itself came in the cheap box. The one genuine hardware upgrade is live sonar, and it is worth it for the right angler. And the single variable that beats every dollar in the building is a clean, careful mount that costs you absolutely nothing. So before you sign for anything, do one thing. Go and look at exactly where that puck is going to sit on your hull, in clean water, away from the prop. And if the installer waves you off and tells you it does not matter, turn around and walk out, because it is the one thing that does. You now know what the guy standing next to you at the ramp, the one who spent his kid's tuition on a glass dashboard, still has not figured out. And the next time a salesman walks you toward the big bright screen and swears to you that it hears more fish, you will know exactly what he is really selling you. Not a sharper way to hear the fish. Just a more comfortable place to sit and read about them after the cheap box already found them. This is Forbidden Lures. Keep your knots tight, keep your puck in clean water, and keep listening for what knocks back.